This video is the first in a series on the Japanese bookbinding style called Fukuro-toji, or in English it's known as pouch binding. The reason it's called pouch binding is because the pages form pouches. This may seem a little bit odd because when you do it this way you can't write on the inside of a paper, which would be wasteful, except that if you consider traditional Japanese paper, which is called washi, the way it's made unsized, which means that anything that you write on the front side bleeds through to the back side. So you can only ever write on one side of the paper anyway. So it makes a lot more sense then to hide the side with the bleed through on the inside where you don't have to look at it. So this video is going to cover making the inner binding. Future videos will show how to do the covers and then some of the different stitching styles that can be used for the outer binding. So let's get started. The first step is to get your paper. I tend to use printer paper because it's cheap and easily available and it's great for practicing on. I use printer paper cut in half to make nice little handy sized notebooks. So you're going to fold each paper separately in half. And then you're going to crease it. You can use your thumbnail, works alright, or if you have one, a bone folder, which is not actually made of bone most of the time despite its name. Works well. And I generally do roughly 20 or so pieces of paper. I find that makes a good sized book. It's fairly easy to punch through, but has enough pages to be worthwhile to write on. So we're going to skip ahead to the part where I have already folded the rest. At this stage, you can, if you want, place the folded edges into a press to press them down so that they're nice and creased a little better. But since you're going to be placing the entire book in the press at the end, you can also do that later. So you're going to stack your pages. Make sure that they're all nice and lined up. You want your front edge to be smooth and lined up, and all of your other edges as much as possible smooth and lined up. And then take binder's clips, and you are going to clip on the side with the folded edge, leaving the unfolded edge free because that's where you're going to be doing the sewing. So take your binder's clip, clip the pages together near the folded edge. Folded edge. It's not going to work if you do it the other way, and it's unusual for most other styles of bookbinding where you work with the folded edge instead of the unfolded edge, so it's worth repeating. So next, we're going to mark where we're going to punch the holes. This is sometimes called a stab stitch binding because you are stabbing your stitches through the thickness of the book instead of through the folds. So for the inner binding, I generally do it at 1/4 of an inch in from the unfolded edge, at least for this size of book. Normally I will just use my creaser and make a crease here so that I can see it, but to make it more visible in the video, I'm going to use a pencil this time. So I make a line, my 1/4 inch, and then I place the stitches 1 inch in from top and bottom. 1 inch, and 1 inch, and then 1/2 inch in from those marks. The exact placement of the holes for the stitches isn't super critical, but the point here is that when we do the outer binding and punch holes to do the outer binding, we don't want to punch holes anywhere near where we've got the stitches for the inner binding, because we don't want to accidentally punch through those stitches, which would weaken the binding. So as long as our location for these stitches is well away from where we're going to punch holes later, we're good. And the distance between them doesn't necessarily have to be exactly half an inch, but that is a distance I found works well. So for our next step, we're going to punch these holes. I do so using an awl. It's a very handy tool for bookbinding. If you don't have one, you can also use a small nail, such as you would use to hang pictures, or a sturdy needle. And if you aren't able to get whatever you're using to poke holes through the entire thickness of the book all at once, you can, at this stage, do it in sections. You may run into trouble later, though, when you're punching holes through the cover and the pages all together. Potentially you could pre-punch all of the holes, but you'll have to be very careful to make sure that you line everything up correctly. One way to do that is to make yourself a template out of a stiffer cardboard type material, and then you would just line your template up with the edges of your book, and you can mark it with a pencil, or even just put whatever you're using to punch in the hole and go nuts. So that is an option as well if you don't have an awl. But if you really want to get into bookbinding, I recommend getting an awl. They're very helpful in a number of styles of bookbinding. And then, since I don't want to punch the tip of my awl into my work table, I have a stack of junk mail and an old phone book that I don't care about, that I use as a backstop. What I'm going to do, I'm going to line my awl up with one of the holes. And I want to make sure that it's straight up and down, not off on an angle. And then I have a rubber mallet that I use to help me drive the awl through the paper, and I'm going to hit it just gently. I'm not trying to break my awl. If you don't have a rubber mallet, a regular hammer or even just a wooden block will work as well. And because it's really loud, I'm actually going to pause the video for a minute and do the hammering and then restart. Alright, all the holes have been punched. One thing you do want to do is make sure that your awl goes through all the way through the backside. It doesn't necessarily need to go this far through the backside. I may have been slightly overzealous, but you do need to make sure it goes all the way through. And then what I like to do is poke through on the other side just to make sure that the hole is the same width all the way through, because if you'll notice, my awl is tapered slightly, so it gets thicker the further up it goes. I'm making sure that I have large holes on this one because I am going to do the traditional method using twisted paper, which I'll show you in just a minute, and it's a lot easier if you have a nice large hole. After that, I'll show you an easier method that doesn't require quite as large a hole, in case you're working with, say, a needle that isn't quite as large. Alright, so now we've got our holes punched, but now we need to do the stitches themselves. So the traditional method, sometimes called a monk's binding, is to twist strips of paper into a cord and use that. I find it's easier if I cut a little slant into it first to help me get it started. It does work a lot better with the Japanese style paper than normal like printer paper. You can do it with printer paper, but it doesn't work nearly as well. So just take one end and start twisting. You want to get it as even and consistent as possible, because weak spots may rip if you tug on it. You just need a long enough twist to go through and tie around. That should be good. So pick whatever the back side is that you want and poke your paper through. It's not exactly the easiest thing in the world, which is why I suggest making the holes a little bigger when you do it this way. And then curl it around and poke it through the other hole in the pear, like this. And then pull it down flat. And then you're going to tie it in a knot. Like that. And then you're going to take your hammer and you're going to give it a good whack. And since it's loud, I'm going to pause for a second while I do that. Okay, and the point of doing that was to help flatten the paper so that it won't come undone as easily. So then you trim the ends. You want to leave enough that it will be difficult for them to come undone, but not so much that they're going to stick out the spine of the book. Like that. And then you do the other side, just the same way. This one I didn't do quite as thin as the other one. No, it doesn't want to work for me today. So I suggest large holes. Let's try it this one. Alright, I'm going to pause for a second while I get this one through. Okay, if you want to do it this way and you have trouble like I was trying to get the paper twist through the hole, your options are you can take your awl, especially if it's a variable one like mine, and make the hole bigger. Or you can snip off a little piece near the end of the paper and try retwisting it so you have a sturdy, stiff piece right at the end. I had to do both of those things. So then we tie it. Like before. And then we pause for a second while I take my hammer and smack it. And then we trim the ends. Voila. That's what it looks like. Especially if you're using Japanese paper, it will blend in fairly well. Not that you'd be able to see it anyway. You'll notice these two are a little bit different. With this one, I did the start of a square knot, and with this one, I did the start of a surgeon's knot. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what a surgeon's knot is, it's one I learned recently, and it's very handy for this. Basically, what you do is, I'm going to demonstrate on my poor little awl. As you can see, I've done that before. So for a regular square knot, you loop your thread, take your thread, you feed the loose end through the loop, and you pull it tight. And then you'll do the same thing again. For a surgeon's knot, rather than looping it once, take your thread, take your loose end, you loop it through the loop, and then before tightening down, you loop it back through the loop. And this time when you tighten down, it stays a lot tighter, which makes it a lot easier to tie a tight knot, because the second knot you're gonna then do the loop again and pull the loose end through the loop and then pull it down tight to form your knot. Just like that. Alright. So, why that matters is because the easier way of doing this, especially if you don't have good paper for doing the twists, is to do it with a needle and some embroidery floss. So I just use a basic embroidery needle because it has a wide enough eye for me to feed the embroidery floss through. Thread it, take it in through whatever you've decided is the back. Maybe make your holes a little bigger than I made mine. Hold on. Can make a slightly bigger hole real quick. Whatever size you make your holes, you want it to be easy to feed either the paper or the needle with the thread on it through. No point in being frustrated by trying to feed it through a hole that is too small. Although pliers work well for that. So, there we go, much better. And then you feed it back through its pair. And then you'll notice I didn't even bother cutting it because you end up needing such a little amount. So you want it flat on the front side. And then you're going to take and you're going to tie your surgeon's knot, or if you don't want to do the surgeon's knot, you can do the square knot. I recommend the surgeon's knot. So I've looped it once, and I loop it again, and then I pull it down and it stays nice and tight while I do my second set of loop. And this time you only have to do it once. And then you pull it tight. You have a nice tight knot, relatively speaking. And then you trim your ends. Same as before, we don't want them sticking out past the spine. And then you do the same thing on the other pair. So in from the back, and then in through the front. Shorten your long tail here, make sure it's flat on front, and then tie your surgeon's knot. So loop, wrap it once, wrap it twice, pull it tight. And loop it again, wrap it once, pull it tight, and then trim your ends. At this point you can take the clips off. Because all of the pages are bound together. Same with the paper binding. Now I will note here that the first and last pages will end up being glued down to the cover to form your end pages, like this one was. So if you want decorative end pages, you'll have to add them to your stack before you do this inner binding. And if you want a certain number of pages in your book, make sure you add 2 extra, one for the front, one for the back. But that's it.